the vengeance weapon that went intercontinental. Before the Soviets or Americans even knew they were racing, the Germans had already fired the starting gun. Deep under the pine forests of northern Germany, concrete launch bunkers pointed into the sky. The weapon they housed was called the Vergeltungswaffe, the V2. Its name meant vengeance weapon, but that undersold what it really was. This was the world's first ballistic missile, a machine that could arc through the edge of space and strike a target 200 miles away at nearly 4,000 miles per hour. It didn't just bomb cities, it redefined the idea of distance. When the first V2 detonated over London in 1944, no one heard it coming. It broke the sound barrier long before the blast reached the ground. Civilians described it as lightning without thunder. The psychological effect mattered as much as the damage. You couldn't dodge it, you couldn't shoot it down, you never even saw it. For the first time, war came from beyond the atmosphere. The mastermind behind it, Wernher von Braun, understood the symbolism. In every speech he gave to energy-starved ministers, he hinted at versions that could fly farther, across continents, even oceans. His early sketches showed missiles with wings for re-entry glides, larger fuel tanks, clustered engines. One concept, the 9/10, was designed to reach New York City from Europe. Theoretically, it could have done it. Whether he meant it as propaganda or genuine aspiration is still debated, but the math checked out. The Nazi vision of vengeance was already evolving into the blueprint for intercontinental warfare. The Allies who later uncovered these plans were stunned. They realized that the Germans had been trying to scale rocketry at industrial levels, not experimental ones. Inside factories like Mittelwerk, forced laborers built thousands of missiles by hand, following engineering notes that looked like something from decades in the future. When the documents were translated after the war, American analysts reportedly reacted with disbelief. How had an economy, collapsing under bombing, diverted so much effort into technology barely understood anywhere else? Von Braun's team at Peenemünde had built more than a missile. They built an ecosystem. Telemetry systems, guidance gyros, precision pumps, and the software of the era, detailed analog equations that would later morph into early computing. Each successful launch taught them about atmospheric drag, fuel mix, and engine vibration, data no other country possessed. And they didn't stop at the V2's limitations. Von Braun proposed a two-stage rocket capable of exiting Earth's atmosphere. He called it Project America. In theory, it would carry a 1-ton warhead to North America, an intercontinental ballistic missile before that term existed. His proposal reached Hitler's desk in late 1944. Even the Führer thought it sounded impossible. But von Braun's engineers didn't stop drafting. They calculated engine thrust vectors, nose cone trajectories, even heat shield concepts, ideas that would resurface 20 years later in the Apollo program. By the spring of 1945, Peenemünde was a ruin, bombed into silence. But the paperwork survived. When Soviet troops reached the northern launch grounds, they found gutted hangars, but crates filled with blueprints and half-assembled rocket bodies. The test stands still reeked of alcohol fuel. Photographs from that day show Soviet engineers inspecting missile fragments, taking measurements, cataloging every component. Many of those same fragments would reappear months later at a new facility outside Moscow, reshaped into the R-1, the Soviet Union's first ballistic missile, a near-identical twin of the V2. Meanwhile, the Americans got the heart of the operation. Von Braun's core team surrendered to them, bringing knowledge the Soviets couldn't replicate easily, the cumulative experience of hundreds of launches. Within months, those same engineers were working for the US Army at Fort Bliss and later at Redstone Arsenal. The V2s they helped rebuild for testing in White Sands, New Mexico, carried American flags on their fins. To the public, they were trophies. To the military, they were prototypes. Both superpowers were now operating on the same foundation, the same schematics, same engines, even the same German vocabulary for parts. Where the Soviets had metal fragments, the Americans had mentors, but both had momentum. Engineers on each side worked through nights trying to understand what the Germans had barely finished creating. It was technological reverse engineering at the scale of an entire civilization. The rocket that von Braun once imagined carrying explosives across the ocean soon became something else entirely. In the US, it evolved into the Redstone and Jupiter missile programs, later fueling NASA's launch systems. In the USSR, Gertrup's German team on Gorodomlia Island guided Soviet designers toward the R-7, the missile that would one day lift Sputnik into orbit. The same mechanism of war turned into the beginning of space exploration. But back in 1945, no one was thinking about satellites. They were thinking about atomic payloads. The Americans had just seen what nuclear weapons could do. Combine that with the distance of a V2, and suddenly no target on Earth was safe. The Soviets reached the same conclusion. The V2 wasn't a curiosity, it was the delivery mechanism every power now needed. Material shortages forced innovation. Soviet metallurgists copied the German alloy recipes, but adapted them to local resources, developing lighter casings that improved range. In America, testing continued at White Sands. Reporters wrote enthusiastic stories about captured rockets, while the scientists behind them quietly proposed scaling the engines to carry tenfold payloads. Within a year, those experiments became classified. Rocketry had crossed from curiosity to national defense policy. The irony is how little ideological difference there really was once the missiles were reprinted. The same guidance equations calculated by German mathematicians now served rival empires. The same turbine pumps and fuel flow systems appeared in both nations, technical manuals, only the language changed. In a very literal sense, the Cold War's arms race started as a joint German project, one that merely split down ideological lines. Inside the Soviet sphere, Helmut Gertrup oversaw test models of the R1 while under tight surveillance. Letters from him describe a haunting scene, German engineers guarded by soldiers, yet still discussing stabilization algorithms as if at an academic symposium. Across the Atlantic, von Braun's team lived in fenced compounds in Texas, surrounded by MPs, designing redesigned V2 stages under Army supervision. Neither side intended to stop until they made those rockets reach farther, faster, and higher. Technological escalation followed naturally. The Soviets modified the V2 into the R2 with doubled range. The Americans countered with Redstone tests carrying mock warheads. Each success from one camp triggered breakthroughs in the other. Within 5 years, both had viable prototypes for missiles capable of striking across continents. The intercontinental dream Hitler had once entertained became a geopolitical nightmare realized. What nobody could acknowledge publicly was that the Cold War's nuclear delivery systems, the very thing that defined deterrence, descended directly from a weapon designed by Nazi Germany. It was the ultimate act of repurposing. Vengeance turned into balance of power. By the early 195s, historians looking back saw a clear line. From Peenemoon's launch pads to White Sands and the Kazakh steppe, the trajectory curved seamlessly. The V2's shadow stretched from London's wartime blackouts to the edge of space. Every satellite, every ICBM, every manned space mission carried a trace of that original blue ink. When von Braun later claimed he'd always dreamed of reaching the stars, not destroying cities, it sounded like reinvention, but perhaps he meant it. The science of retribution had become the science of exploration. Yet for all its accomplishments, it began as a weapon meant to bypass oceans and borders. That was the quiet truth both superpowers inherited. The ultimate vengeance weapon didn't just cross continents, it erased them. Lines on maps stopped mattering once rockets entered the equation. The world had entered an age where wars could be decided not by who conquered territory, but by who mastered velocity. And while rockets were clawing their way toward orbit, another branch of German innovation was already waiting to claim the skies themselves. Machines faster than sound, powered by engines that didn't even need propellers. Jet age before its time. While rockets were lifting ambitions into the stratosphere, another revolution was screaming across European skies at treetop height. It was the sound Allied pilots first mistook for thunder, a shrill metallic howl that cut through propeller noise like a blade. The source was the Messerschmitt Me-262, the world's first operational jet fighter and the most visible glimpse of a war decades ahead of itself. It looked alien, swept wings, twin nacelles, silver skin that reflected sunlight in blinding flashes. When it appeared, it seemed to break time. German engineers had been chasing jet propulsion since the late 193s. Hans von Ohain's Heinkel designs had proven the concept, but it was the Junkers Jumo 004 engine that made the dream real. Compact, axial flow, and brutally efficient, it produced nearly 2,000 pounds of thrust, double what any piston engine could manage. The Me-262 could fly 40% faster than the best Allied fighters and climb at rates considered impossible. Hitler once demanded it serve as a bomber. His interference delayed production, but the underlying technology was sound. If built in numbers, the jet could have rewritten air combat before the war ended. Allied pilots who encountered it described hopeless chases. The Me-262 would appear behind them, fire a burst of 30mm shells, and vanish into the clouds. Its vulnerability lay only in its takeoff and landing stages when its fragile turbine blades needed gentle acceleration. Still, to engineers watching test footage after the war, the sheer speed looked like sorcery. They realized that in a few short years, Germany's labs had leaped past decades of global aeronautical progress. In workshops from Augsburg to Dessau, experimentation went further. The 162 Volksjäger, or People's Fighter, used the smaller BMW 003 jet engine perched atop its fuselage. It was crude but cheap, wooden wings, bolted on metal fuselage, assembled by barely trained workers. The design highlighted both desperation and brilliance, a mass-produced jet light enough to outrun conventional aircraft built from the scraps of a dying economy. By war's end, these engines and airframes became prizes. The Americans captured several operational Me-262 and hauled them onto flatbed trucks destined for research fields in the United Kingdom and the United States. British technicians from de Havilland studied the turbines down to the last bolt. At the same time, Soviet recovery teams swept airfields across eastern Germany, loading BMW 003 and Jumo 004 into boxcars bound for Moscow. Each side believed it had found the key to post-war air supremacy. Inside the hangars, the difference between Allied and Axis craftsmanship was startling, almost unsettling. German engines looked otherworldly, turbines lined with alloys no one had ever seen, nickel-chromium mixes engineered to survive temperatures that melted Allied prototypes. Their engineers had wrestled with airflow, combustion, vibration, problems that defeated others, reducing them to predictable numbers. It wasn't magic, but to the first pilots who saw them, it felt like it. They hadn't solved everything. Engine life was barely 25 hours, but they had solved enough to prove the concept. That foundation became the template for jet aviation everywhere. For the Soviets, the captured engines served as direct models. Teams at the Lyulka and Klimov design Euros dismantled the Jumo 004, drafted new blueprints in Cyrillic, and reproduced it as the RD-10. The BMW 003 turned into the RD-20. These powered early post-war fighters like the Mi-G9, a transitional aircraft that bridged propeller era and jet age. Engineers quickly discovered limits in the copied metals, forcing innovations that created more durable Soviet turbines. Within 2 years, those improvements birthed the Mi-G15, the jet that would later dominate skies over Korea, a machine whose ancestry traced unmistakably to Germany's Jumo lineage. Across the Atlantic, American analysts at Wright Field and NACA took apart the same equipment. The aerodynamic lessons fed directly into swept wing research that produced the F-86 Sabre. Engineers studied how the Me-262 maintained stability near transonic speeds and how its wing sweep delayed shockwave formation. Those data sets became the language of high-speed flight. Without them, the early US jet fleet might have remained vulnerable to Soviet advances built on the very same German logic. What fascinates historians is how rapidly imitation turned into innovation. In less than a decade, copies of wartime jet engines inspired wholly new designs reaching Mark I and beyond. What began as salvage ended as superiority. But in 1945, standing among twisted airframes, no one saw that future clearly. They only knew these engines represented velocity as power, speed as deterrence. Whoever mastered the jet would define not just air combat, but global presence. At Peenemünde's ruined airstrip, Soviet officers filmed experimental German turbojets running under makeshift setups. Sparks ripped through cracked exhausts as technicians measured output. Those reels, later declassified, show the eerie birth of a new military philosophy. Control the temperatures of metal, and you control the limits of warfare. Propellers were becoming obsolete in real time. Meanwhile, in the United States, test pilots strapped into captured Me-262s at Wright Field. They returned shaken but inspired. One wrote in his report, "This aircraft has no predecessor." The finding wasn't just about performance. It proved that complexity could be industrialized. If Germany had managed large-scale jet engine production earlier, the Allies might have lost air superiority entirely. That realization fueled urgency unmatched even during wartime. Jet research budgets soared. The US Army Air Forces funded programs to combine German compression ratios with American metallurgy. Britain's Rolls-Royce obtained a Jumo engine to examine the axial flow concept, leading directly to the Avon series. Every superpower essentially began its post-war aviation story by copying a captured enemy prototype. Yet the moral unease was hard to ignore. Many of the engineers whose signatures appeared on those blueprints had worn Nazi uniforms. In Moscow, their names were erased. In Washington, they were anglicized. Political necessity dictated forgetting. The focus was performance, not provenance. Laboratory secrecy replaced contrition. The result was progress divorced from origin. By the late 194s, the transformation was visible everywhere. Soviet test pilots broke altitude records in MiGs powered by improved RD engines. British and American jets chased the sound barrier. The battlefield of the skies expanded into contested speed records and technological spectacle. The Cold War's first real rivalry wasn't nuclear, it was aerodynamic. Every engine tested, every wing redesigned, echoed the same truth. The future of warfare had shifted from numbers to velocity. Strategic advantage now depended on who could fly higher, faster, and longer. That philosophy would drive defense policy for generations, from supersonic interceptors to hypersonic prototypes decades later. Looking back, the lineage seems almost continuous. Draw a line from the Me-262 nacelles through the My-G-15's intake to the F-86's swept wings, and forward to spaceplane concepts, the DNA matches. Each iteration retained lessons first etched into German alloy under wartime pressure. The engineers themselves rarely spoke about ideology afterward. When Hans von Ohain later lectured in the United States, he described his wartime work as the pursuit of efficiency for its own sake. That understatement concealed a harder reality. Efficiency born of collapse, perfected under coercion, then adopted by the victors. The jet age before its time ended with Germany's defeat, but its echo propelled the world into a new arms race. In the glow of jet exhaust, the boundary between offense and exploration blurred again. And deep inside Soviet facilities, another kind of German machine was already being rebuilt, not to conquer the air, but to reach beyond it altogether. The Soviet rocket island. In late 1946, as autumn fog rolled through the rail yards of East Germany, quiet convoys began to form in the dark. They weren't carrying weapons or prisoners of war. They were carrying the future. Soviet officers knocked on doors at midnight with instructions read in broken German. "Pack, you're being relocated for scientific work." The operation lasted just one night. Trains bound east-left almost simultaneously from dozens of towns. By dawn, the last wagons were sealed, their windows painted over. Inside sat more than 2,000 engineers, technicians, and their families, people who had built Germany's rockets and were now being moved to rebuild them for Stalin. The code name was Operation Osoaviakhim, and its orders came directly from the Soviet High Command. They didn't just want blueprints, they wanted brains. Among those taken was Helmut Gertrup, Wernher von Braun's former deputy, an expert in missile guidance. He and hundreds of his colleagues soon discovered their destination, an isolated research outpost on Gorodomlia Island in Lake Selija, about 200 miles northwest of Moscow. The Soviets called it a security zone. To the Germans who arrived shivering in the cold, it felt like exile. The island was small, barely 3 miles long, ringed by barbed wire and patrolled by armed guards. A short wooden bridge connected it to the mainland, always watched. Letters in and out were censored. Visitors required military clearance. But behind that fence stood laboratories humming with stolen ambition. The Soviets had gathered their new workforce and told them plainly, rebuild the V2, improve it, teach us everything you know. Gertrup described his first weeks there as a paradox, imprisoned, yet privileged. Guard towers framed laboratories gleaming with precision tools, armed sentries outside, chalk dust and blueprints inside. Soviet engineers sat beside their German counterparts, communicating through translators and tension. It wasn't cooperation, it was captivity engineered to look like teamwork. Each team paired one German specialist with 2 Soviet apprentices. The unspoken goal was clear: transfer knowledge as quickly as possible, then render the Germans unnecessary. From Moscow's perspective, Gorodomlia was both a school and a quarantine. Stalin didn't trust these men, but he couldn't afford to ignore them. Soviet officers referred to the project as borrowing talent. In practice, it was forced collaboration. Teams dissected remaining V2 fragments shipped from occupied zones, rebuilding engines from memory. They ran fuel tests in open sheds that froze overnight. When components failed, Moscow sent trains of additional experts. Every calculation, every drawing, belonged to the state the moment pencil touched paper. Despite confinement, the Germans adapted. They built small gardens around their quarters and organized Sunday concerts in the mess hall. Some claimed it reminded them of university life, only surrounded by sentries. Others felt the constant pressure of usefulness, the awareness that productivity equaled survival. As long as we helped rockets fly, we were safe, one recalled decades later. Their main product became the R1, a near-exact copy of the German V2 built with Soviet materials. The challenge wasn't understanding the physics, it was reproducing the metallurgy and manufacturing tolerances the Germans once achieved. Soviet industries lacked some allies, forcing improvisations. Gertrup's notes show endless recalculations for substituted metals and new weld methods. Failures were frequent, but each explosion during testing taught something vital about fuel dynamics and stage stability. By 1948, the R1 finally launched successfully from the Kapustin Yar test range. Official photographs show Soviet generals smiling under plumes of exhaust, but behind them stood a group of Germans applauding quietly, unacknowledged. The propaganda announcements made no mention of foreign assistance. The missile was celebrated as a triumph of socialist science, though it was, in large part, a duplication exercise. Yet that duplication served its purpose. The Soviets now possessed the foundation for their own missile industry. Meanwhile, tensions on the island deepened. The Germans wanted recognition, the Soviets wanted independence. Communication between the two sides slipped into rivalry. When Soviet engineers produced design variations without consulting their teachers, arguments erupted. By 1949, the locals began to outnumber their mentors. One directive from Moscow bluntly stated, reduce reliance on German advisors. Translation, absorb what remains and prepare for removal. Life on Gorodomlia oscillated between tedium and quiet fear. The families could stroll only within the perimeter, listening at night to the distant trains that never stopped. Children attended makeshift German language schools under watchful soldiers. Newspapers arrived censored and weeks old. Yet within those fences, breakthroughs continued. The R2 design doubled the range of its predecessor, and talk began of multi-stage systems capable of orbit. The Germans were sketching the stepping stones to Sputnik without knowing it. Ethically, the contradiction became unbearable to some. These were the same men who once harnessed forced labor for Hitler's weapons, now themselves confined by another dictatorship. Gertrup later wrote that he felt caught in an endless loop of calculation and captivity, yet he refused to sabotage his work. Professional pride overruled politics. He once told a Soviet colleague, "A trajectory doesn't know ideology." That single sentence defined the era. Outside the island, Soviet propaganda celebrated miraculous advances in rocketry. Nowhere did it mention Gorodomlia. Western intelligence, aware of the kidnappings, speculated about secret bases in the USSR, but couldn't locate them precisely. When aerial reconnaissance finally mapped the island years later, they saw no walls, just narrow paths between warehouses, an ordinary shape hiding extraordinary secrets. As the Cold War thickened, the usefulness of the German contingent declined. Soviet designers like Sergei Korolev had studied under them long enough to stand alone. In 195, Moscow began repatriating selected families. Officially, it was a gesture of goodwill. In reality, it marked the moment Soviet rocketry became self-sufficient. Within a few years, those same Soviet-developed engines derived from R-series research would propel the first artificial satellite and later the first human into space. The island had fulfilled its grim purpose. When the remaining Germans finally left in the early 195s, they returned to a homeland split by ideology and suspicion. Many were interrogated by Allied intelligence. Few spoke publicly about their years of work. Official Soviet reports reduced them to a footnote. Foreign specialists temporarily engaged in early design studies. But history would later reveal the truth. The knowledge transferred on Gorodomlia became the bedrock of the Soviet missile program. Contemporary accounts describe the farewell scene. Engineers standing on the dock, watching the island fade into fog, unsure whether they were free or discarded. Some carried only notebooks filled with anonymous equations. Others left behind prototypes never claimed. One reportedly whispered, "We built a bridge we can never cross again." In their absence, younger Soviet teams accelerated progress, combining their lessons with Korolev's ambition. From that moment, the Soviet space race had its first firm footing. Gorodomlia remains a quiet place today, its buildings repurposed, its fences long gone. But beneath its soil lies the trace of that peculiar symbiosis, German imagination and Soviet command welded together by necessity. What began as enforced servitude became the launchpad for spacefaring dreams. The irony still lingers. The path to orbit started not in freedom, but under guard towers reflected on a frozen lake. America's shadow army of scientists. When the war ended, the United States faced a quiet paradox. Publicly, it championed justice, Nuremberg, denazification, trials for war criminals. Privately, it was assembling an army of those same men, not to punish them, but to put them back to work. This was Operation Paperclip, the classified effort to import more than 1,600 German scientists, engineers, and technicians into American laboratories. The name came from the paperclips attached to their altered dossiers, clipped pages hiding Nazi affiliations, rewritten biographies that turned yesterday's enemies into tomorrow's assets. For the officials running it, morality bent easily under the weight of national security. The Soviet Union had seized half of Germany's research base, and Washington couldn't afford to fall behind. President Truman officially prohibited recruiting active Nazis, but Army intelligence simply retyped resumes and removed problematic lines. The question asked in briefing rooms wasn't who they were, but what they knew. The first arrivals stepped off transport planes in surplus US Army coats that didn't quite fit. Instead of interrogators, handlers waited with handshakes and non-disclosure forms. There was no trial, no punishment, just silent absorption into America's war machine under a different banner. Men like Wernher von Braun, Arthur Rudolph, and Hubertus Strughold, scientists who had built V-2 rockets, tested engines on forced laborers, even designed freezing experiments, were given new homes and blank slates. Their transit paperwork listed them as important specialists. Within months, they were drawing government salaries. At Fort Bliss in Texas and later at Redstone Arsenal in Alabama, Von Braun's team resumed the same work they'd done for Hitler, perfecting ballistic missiles. Only the flag above the hangar had changed. They rebuilt captured V-2s, ran flight tests in the desert, and recorded data on high-altitude trajectories. American officers watched the launches with fascination, sometimes forgetting that the crowd cheering beside them had once worn swastika pins. Bureaucrats framed Paperclip as a pragmatic necessity. The Cold War was beginning, and the race to understand rocketry and jet propulsion had no pause. Yet to many inside the Pentagon, it felt uneasy. Counterintelligence officers wrote memos warning of moral contamination, then filed them away. In public, the scientists remained ghosts. Their presence wasn't acknowledged for decades. The official records described acquired German materials. The phrase conveniently blurred the line between equipment and men. Wernher von Braun knew how to navigate this new environment. He spoke fluent English within months, played the piano at officers' gatherings, and posed for photographs modeling rockets beside smiling generals. When asked about his past, he answered cheerfully that his only loyalty had been to science. The army agreed. He became the symbolic face of America's new rocket age, clean-cut, visionary, apolitical. Behind the charm stood a technical empire rebuilt in exile. At White Sands Proving Ground, the desert sky became a laboratory. German-assembled rockets rose out of concrete pads, carrying measuring instruments instead of warheads. The data fed into early atmospheric research, then into plans for longer-range missiles. Engineers from von Braun's group quietly taught American counterparts how to build fuel pumps, guidance systems, and telemetry circuits. Each test drew them deeper into U.S. defense strategy. By 1948, the work had gone beyond replication. They were designing prototypes under Army contract. The boundary between imported science and native innovation vanished. Meanwhile, political operatives in Washington worked to keep the public unaware. Journalists who asked inconvenient questions were told these scientists were refugee technicians assisting reconstruction. Only classified committees knew the full scale. Mathematicians, physicians, chemists, aerodynamicists, spread across 66 U.S. installations from Dayton to Pasadena. It was a diaspora of expertise with one shared origin in the ruins of the Reich. Not all assignments involved rockets. Hubertus Strughold, once linked to aviation medicine experiments, was relocated to the Aeromedical Research Laboratory in Ohio. There he developed pressure chamber studies that later underpinned American astronaut training. Arthur Rudolph, chief engineer of the Mittelwerk factory built on slave labor, oversaw the Redstone missile production line for the Army Ballistic Missile Agency. These men lived in pleasant suburbs, their histories sanitized. Neighbors knew them as professors, not participants. Yet inside military circles, admiration blurred with unease. One Air Force colonel described Paperclip as the most efficient theft in history. The scientists produced results, measurable, tangible progress that accelerated every missile program the US touched, but the moral ledger stayed hidden. Behind every launch statistic lay thousands of erased crimes justified as unfortunate context. By the early 50s, the payoff was undeniable. The Redstone missile, drawing directly from V-2 architecture, became America's first reliable medium-range ballistic weapon. Its guidance systems refined in classified rooms at Redstone would later push payloads beyond orbit. Von Braun presented test footage to generals, emphasizing precision and altitude while omitting provenance. To the military, it didn't matter.